Storytime with Stephanie Story.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Story. I'm an art historical novelist. Welcome to my show, Storytime, where I get to talk to other authors about their passions and their projects. My guest today is a journalist from Boston, but her debut novel came out just earlier this year. It was hailed by no big deal, USA Today and Newsweek and Buzzfeed and all kinds of outlets as one of the most anticipated books of the year. I'm very excited to talk to her about being a debut novelist and going from journalism to noveling, a little bit different. And and her downright obsession with the environment and the natural world. The novel is called Waiting for the Night Song. Welcome to the show, Julie Carrick Dalton.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
I am so excited to talk to you about this book and to talk to you about all of these obsessions and all the cool stuff that you put of yourself into this novel. So before we get started, please tell my audience at home a little about your book.
Great. Well, thanks. So Waiting for the Night Song is my debut novel. It's a thriller. It's a thriller. It came out in January from Forge Books at Macmillan. And it's primarily a story about a female friendship. It's about this fierce friendship, secrets and betrayal and redemption. And it's all set against the backdrop of this of a slowly changing climate in a small town in New Hampshire. And the story is told in two timelines. So my main character, her name is Katie Kessler, and she's 11 years old in some of the chapters, and she's in her late 30s in the other chapters. And we go back and forth. So there's this thing that happens when she's a child, this traumatic event she witnesses and chooses to not report it. And this choice she makes ripples into for the rest of her life. It impacts everything about who she becomes as an adult. And she experienced this with her best friend, Daniela, and it ruptured their friendship and they went separate ways, this event. But as an adult, Katie is an entomologist. She works for the forestry department, and she's trying to prove that an invasive beetle has entered the forest in New Hampshire and is threatening to kill off the forest and set off forest fires. So when we meet her, she's at this really pivotal point in her career of trying desperately to prove this beetle is there when nobody's listening, when she gets a message from this childhood friend saying the secret of theirs has been unearthed. So the worst thing from her past and the toughest challenge of her career hit you right in the first chapter. So she's facing all these issues of trying to save the forest, and her environmental passions come through, and she's choosing whether she's going to break the law to prove she's right, and it's a lot of ethical things. And then there's the friendship of rebuilding this really important friendship. So for me, it's like my love of my childhood, romping in the woods and running around, and my passion now as a organic farmer. So there's a whole lot of me in this story.
So what did drive you to finally write a novel? Because it is a giant undertaking. You don't have to do it as a writer. What finally got you, which part of this story made you go, that's it, I gotta write the novel?
Yeah, so I was a journalist for a long time, and I have this theory that, I don't know, as a journalist, you're bound by facts, which you absolutely should be bound by facts. But the facts don't always tell a whole truth. You can people can use the same set of facts and tell really different stories. And so sometimes as a journalist, I think you're bound by the facts, which is, like I said, a really good thing for journalists, but sometimes you can't get at those bigger truths you want to tell. And I felt compelled to tell this story because I felt there were these things on my heart and stories I wanted to share, and they weren't all wrapped up in facts. So there's a lot of science in my book. And if you read it, it's all real science. I didn't make up any of the science, but I made up the story. And I made up the individuals to reveal the impact, because I really think, especially, this has, the climate change element is in the background of the story. It's not like a book about climate change, but it is very much in the story. And I think it's a great gateway into conversations about climate, because it's a story. It's a story about a friendship that's a really meaningful, beautiful, complicated friendship. But these other elements come in, and it allows me to engage in these conversations like we're having about climate in a way I couldn't as a journalist, because I was just reporting information. And now I feel like I'm mining emotions.
Okay, so was it the telling? So the climate was really the thing that made you go, I gotta dive deeper, or was it the friendship part? I mean, not that those two things are interrelated, but you know what I mean? What got your heart and made you, when you don't want to get up and you don't want to sit down and you don't want to write, this is the worst thing I've ever written, and you're going through those slumps of writing, what part of it kept you going to get through it?
Well, the idea for the book, like the little nugget, the seed was, so there's in the book, in the childhood timeline, my main character, Katie, and her best friend, Daniela, get hold of this rowboat that isn't really theirs for the taking, but they use this boat. And they are picking blueberries, which is just this idyllic New Englandy thing to do. They're picking blueberries off the shore, but it's not their land. And it's just these wide open shores. It's not like they're taking them from someone else, but they aren't their blueberries for the taking. So they invented these rules about why it was okay to take the blueberries. And it's this very central part of the story about how they make up these rules to justify behavior. And the reason I wrote that is because I have 4 kids, and I used to take them blueberry picking in a canoe on a lake in New Hampshire, and we would pick blueberries. And they started asking me, whose blueberries are they? Whose land is this? Are we stealing them? And I was like, no, it's fine. Nobody cares if you take a couple handfuls of blueberries. And I started like unconsciously making up rules why it was okay that we were taking blueberries, which nobody would have cared on this open pieces of land. But that idea of like how we make up rules to justify behavior got really in my head. And that was the nugget that set the story in motion, was this idea of little girls doing something seemingly innocent, but having to justify their behavior. And what happens later in the story is they swear an oath to this list of rules they create and use it to shield themselves from to cover up a crime. And it was really an exploration of how we kind of trick ourselves in a way of like swearing an oath to something and shielding ourselves from it. So basically the story started in a moment of bad parenting for me. And then the environmental elements just poured out because I feel very strongly about those things. So I think it was the friendship and the environmental elements pushed me through the story because I felt very strongly about them, but it was really started on a moment of bad parenting.
Yeah, but it's really interesting that the environment came into that, because that's what we do as a culture, right? Is we make up these excuses for why we can do something that's seemingly innocent, that doesn't feel that bad, that ends up being really detrimental to our world and our climate.
Yeah.
I mean that's also connected right there. That's fascinating that was the germ that got you into it. Okay, so where does your obsession with climate, and because you've written a lot about climate, not just in this book, and you speak about it, and you are the environment and our natural world and climate change is very important to you. Where did that start with you?
I'm not really sure. I think it's just always been a part of me in that I grew up in an area where we had a lot of woods, and I would just run around with my friends and climbing trees and building forts and playing in the woods and, coming home for dinner. And I had a free range childhood, which mattered a lot to me. And then later in life, this tract of land went on the market near my home. And it was this huge tract of forest that we have bear and moose and deer that walk out of the woods into my yard. And I love these animals. And every time I see them, they make me so happy. But they were timbering and developing the forest that was in between, that was where these animals came from. And I went and walked the property, and I just felt so like wounded thinking about these trees being torn down and all these animals being displaced. And I did the completely irrational, illogical, like nonsensical thing, and I bought it. It was at the pit of recession when people are selling off all this land at really like low-ish prices, but I needed a business to do it to make sense. So I was like, well, I guess I could be a farmer. So I bought it, and on the land they'd already cleared, I built a farm. And in my agricultural research, I got to know, and then I preserved 92 acres of the forest, which I now manage. And I opened it up as that people can walk all my trails. I opened it to the public. There's the miles of trails in my woods. And for me, I felt like I couldn't sit there and just let all these trees be cut down and all these animals displaced. And it really grounded me in the land and made me more passionate. I wasn't thinking about it all the time before, but it made me think of my childhood and think of those woods that I grew up in. So now when I was doing all this agricultural research, a lot of the information when I was building my farm from the ground up, knowing nothing about agriculture, by the way, I had to do a lot of work, and a lot of that information poured into my story. And that's a lot of the science, the forestry information, just the elements of land conservation came because this was the same year as I was writing the book. I was in the daytime digging in the dirt, moving rocks, working on fences, planting things, making terrible mistakes, and then going home and writing at night. And all that stuff came into the book. So that's how the environmental stuff came into the book, because that was what I was living. at the moment. And it's the backdrop of my book, because it's kind of like in my mind, they're the same story, the story of my farm and the story of my book. I was like raising twins, I was like working on both of them, and they grew up together, and I can't really separate them in my mind.
That's fast. So while you're learning to, not that you've been a journalist forever, not that you're learning to write, but when you're learning to write a novel, which is a whole other beast, and trying to set up, you're learning to be an organic farmer and take care of this huge tract of land and doing all of this stuff. Okay, so what did either writing teach you about tending to this huge area of land, or what did doing that with the land teach you about writing? Did those things feed off of each other?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think they did, especially, I mean, in the very, specific context of this book, they very much fed off each other because of the research I was doing, but in a like more, bigger craft kind of issue, there's like an element of patience you have to have with nature, because something I learned very early on is you cannot edit or revise nature. You can amend your soil, you can make decisions, you can plant things, but there are elements of it you cannot control. And in writing a book, as hard as it is, and as frustrating, and I know this, it can just be like exasperating. You do have control of the words on the page. They could be terrible words, but I mean, you wrote those words. You can change every one of those words, and you can eliminate them. But when on working with land, there are things you can, influence, but you have to also roll with it. It's like, in a book, you never get a chapter that somebody's like, this chapter has to go in there, just, deal with it. Like that doesn't happen. But in a farm, when you're growing things, like if you get an infestation, which I have had, I can't just be like, I'm just gonna, write them off, especially if you're an organic farmer, because you can't just eliminate things. You need to be patient and take that information and apply it to the next year. Whereas in writing, you can apply it to the next sentence or the next chapter, but you need to like be really patient and be willing to like know things are just going to not work sometimes. Like I've had entire corn crops fail, and and I have to say, okay, this year there's no corn.
You mentioned this earlier. You grew up in a wooded area, and I was thinking about this because in the book there are like wildfires, there are climate issues. And I was so used to that from living in California, where there's a fire. I mean, in Southern California, we had fire season. We had damp season and fire season. That was it, and the rest of it was warm. And it literally rained ash. Right? You would go to the grocery store, and it would be raining, and it would not be snow. It would be or rain. It would be ash. It was terrifying. But so what experiences do you feel like you get, because you live mainly in Boston?
Yeah.
Do you feel like, what experiences have you had with the climate that have really like impacted you, that you're looking up going, oh, wait, this has happened? Have you had any of those crazy things like that have started?
No, I haven't. I think living in New England, we are, in a privileged position that we're not impacted as much by climate change in ways that we are like consciously aware of. Whereas, I think that most of the places in our, not all, but in the majority of the places in the world where climate is impacting communities in really catastrophic ways tend to be in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities and poor communities without resources. And that's not all. And that's just like, in general, a lot of them are, especially in the United States. We tend to, I'm in New England, I've got water every day. I'm probably not going to be hit by a hurricane, and there's not a lot of wildfires. And it's not to say they can't happen, but that's not my reality every day, which is a super privileged life to lead in this world where there's so many people. The climate refugee situation is, catastrophic worldwide. And the communities that are often facing them first are usually marginalized communities that are either were relegated to the land that wasn't as safe, or they don't have the resources to mitigate climate, or they don't have the resources to leave. And then when climate disasters happen, they don't always have the resources to rebuild in a timely way. So for me, I'm not feeling it directly, but I will say when I was doing the research for my farm, not for the book, I came across this piece of information, which does show up in my book, that my growing region in New Hampshire, my farm, I live in Boston, but I bounce back and forth. The farm's only 2 hours away because my family has had a home up in New Hampshire that we've, vacationed in a lot. That's why the farm's there. But I came across this piece of information that my growing season has expanded by 22 days in the past century because the summer temperature in New Hampshire has gone up by 4 degrees. over a century, which is way disproportionate to the rest of the country. But do you see anybody running around going, oh my God, New Hampshire is the epicenter of climate change? You don't, because it went up very slowly. And it happened over a century. But what does that do to like an ecosystem? And so that worked its way into my book because that was my ecosystem. And so then I was like thinking about like, what does that look like as a, are there crops that don't grow? Are there different species that do grow? And how does it affect forests? Because there's such a long-term entity, it's not seasonal. And I found out that the map of sugar maple trees, those iconic maples that, light the sky on fire in fall, they are moving north. Like if you look at a map of where they are, they're inching further north every year. And it is conceivable that my farm full of sugar maples may not have sugar maples one day. And that is to me like devastating. Can you imagine like New England without maple trees?
No.
And so that really hit me because that is where I am. And it's in flux and it's happening very slowly. So it's not a rushing wall of water coming in. Like it's not like a flood in Houston where it's an event and, the news cameras are focused on it for 3 weeks, but it is happening here. And so I feel like if people feel like climate change isn't affecting them at all, number one, they're probably in a position of privilege, and maybe to like look at why they're not experiencing it, who is, and then maybe dig deeper because maybe you are being affected by it and you don't know it.
So are you going to keep writing? You get so passionate when you talk about this stuff. Are you going to keep writing about climate and environment as a fiction writer? Are you going to?
Yeah, I have another book coming out.
I saw that. It's like The Beekeeper or something.
Yeah, it's called The Last Beekeeper. And I also keep bees. So I love bees. I'm like obsessed with bees. And so I've lost a lot of colonies to colony collapse disorder, which is like, a horrible thing that the whole world is facing. So this book is set in the very near future that I won't put a date on the future world, but just a little bit, like not any weird technology or flying vehicles flying around. It looks like our world, but I introduce an event that hastens the collapse of the pollinators in a way that we aren't prepared for. And there's this, ripple effect of agricultural crisis, food insecurity, economic crisis that it sets off. And it's about the relationship of a beekeeper and his daughter that deteriorates as the bees are dying. And the writing it's for the same audience as Waiting for the Night Song. It's a story primarily of a relationship and of people and home and what makes up a family, but it's set against the backdrop of the loss of our pollinators in this world. And I have a third book idea that I'm hopefully going to be pitching soon to my editor that is again another story that's engaging these elements. And it's always going to be about relationships and people and their connection to each other. But there's always going to be I think there will always be a climate element in the backdrop of all of my writing. And the Last Beekeeper comes out in early 2023. We don't have a date yet, but it'll be the early 2023.
Oh, good. So you're still in the thick of getting it done and getting all of it finished. How is it feeling writing another book? Because this book's done well. People have talked about it. I had that with my first one. I was like, isn't just my mom and her book club supposed to read it?
Yeah,
why are people talking about it? Why? Oh my gosh, this is too big. And then I went into metaphorical child's pose for about 2 years without writing my second book. So you seem to be ahead of me and seem to be handling it okay. But how is it writing that next book, having a success under your belt?
It's a little bit of pressure because I have an actual deadline. The other book I wrote it, then I went out and found an agent and editor. This time I have a date. It's due on October 1st. So call me in September, then see how I'm feeling about it. But I really am loving writing this book. I am super excited. It's a very nature focused, very, a lot of sensory details in it and the writing. I love the story idea. Like the nugget of the story idea in it, I think is really cool. And it's not a story I've seen. And the reason I wanted to write this book is I wanted to read this book so bad and nobody had written it. So I'm like, oh my God, it's me. This is my thing. And I'm loving writing it because I'm discovering a lot of it as I'm going. And I'm engaging all this beekeeping culture, which is like super rich. There's like the vibrations of a hive and the smell of honey and melting wax and all those things are like, it's a gold mine of like stuff you can, pull into a book. So I'm in a happy place with my writing. I might not be so much at the end of September when it's due, but today I'm really happy.
Okay, so you were a journalist for a really long time before you embarked on writing this novel. What's the biggest difference to you between, I mean, other than the length, right? I get
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
And I get that in one you can make stuff up and the other you can't. But what was like the hardest adjustment for you to make between journalism to noveling?
Um, Well, I think, you're freed of a deadline that's a constant deadline, but you
Yeah.
have a looming bigger deadline. So it's like this bigger beast instead of small pieces. But for me, to be honest, I feel much more free, and I think it suits me in a lot of ways better. In part because there are options. You could take it this way or you could take it that way, and there is no right answer, or there's no one source, or there's there's so much room to breathe into a novel. And for me, that feels really good. And I actually loved being a journalist. I mean, I still write articles now, but I mostly write about books or about writing, for different publications. But I still love that. But I feel more myself as a fiction writer, because I feel like really free to explore an idea the way that feels good to me. Whereas a journalist, there is, you have options of who you interview, but there are facts and there is a story that you're there to cover. And although there are many ways to cover a single story, you are bound by the story. Whereas with a novel, it's like my whole world. I create an entire world. And something else that I really, really, I never take this for granted. Anytime somebody picks up in this book, when they like pick this book up and give me 10 hours of their life or 12 hours of their life or however long, they're choosing to set their own worldview aside and take mine up, or take my characters up, see the world through the lens of my character. And that is like an enormous act of generosity of a reader, that they're saying like, I'm going to see the world the way you see it. And so for me, as a writer, I'm painting that world. And that is such a privilege, to create a world that someone else is going to step into. And I feel so like, world building to me is really exciting, because I feel like you're not just creating a world for your characters, but you're creating a world for every reader that picks up your book. And that's like an enormous privilege. I mean, how many people in the world get to create a world and then invite somebody to come hang out in it for 12 hours? So I feel more myself as a novelist. And I have like really fond memories of being in a big story, or on the trail of something, and being so energized by it and absolutely loving the moment. But it was never my story I was chasing. It was another story that I was telling. Whereas with fiction, although I feel like there can be so much truth in fiction, and I'm crafting it. And so I get to mine all the things in me, just like we're talking about why environmentalism matters to me. I got to like mine my deep emotions and feelings. And I write a lot about nature, about, just the sensory details of touching, tasting, smelling, hearing nature, because I feel like I process the world that way. And so I got to share that my way, through my way of telling a story, because my character does a lot of quirky things. Like, I think if you've read the first chapter, you may have noticed she licked a rock because she wanted to see if the rock changed colors at the touch of saliva, because granite does that. Granite has this depth to it and like this crystalline structure that changes colors when it's wet. And my character experiences the world like that because I do. So I get to invite you in, and you get to lick a rock when in my book. So for me, it's like it's putting myself into the story maybe a little bit.
I'm sure it's the journalist in you, right? That you get really into like these details and all this information and all this research. And it sounds very much like ye old historical fiction writers.
Yeah.
So steeped in the research. And so like there are parameters around writing historical fiction, because you have to hit certain dates, you have to hit certain timelines, you have to do all this. Do you seem like you love that kind of research as well? Do you love the parameters it puts on you?
I
Can
do.
you imagine writing a book that's not steeped in journalism like that, or is that like a really important part of the whole noveling process?
I don't know. Like it's just what I want to write. Like, I've never thought about doing a different book. I've never been like, oh, I'm gonna, maybe I'll do this one instead. But like, it's like what it is every idea I come up with is hinged to some sort of element of climate. And it's not the story or the plot, but it's a trigger for me, I guess. Like with the beekeeping story was triggered because I lost all these hives and I was really sad. And I wanted to explore that. But I also, something else, we talk, climate can be a really dark topic. We can go down these rabbit holes. Oh my gosh, we're all doomed and it's going to, do that. I am so solidly in the camp of hope. Like, I think there is hope. And I think that all my books, while they really are based on science, I will never, I say never, I don't know, I've only written one book so far, but I can't see ever writing a book that isn't built on a foundation of hope, because I honestly believe it, for one thing. And I don't think it's a Pollyanna-ish thing. I think there is reason to hope. And I also think if we don't have hope, why bother fighting? Like, why bother trying? And I think that you can have hope and grief simultaneously. Like, you can acknowledge the grief and the loss, but have hope. So I feel like all this data, the research, can be really depressing. When you're researching climate data, it can be really sad and overwhelming and consuming. But I really do think that I see it all with, there is always going to be, like, there's always something to hope for and to, like, try to inspire hope in other people.
Congratulations on
Thank
having
you.
your debut novel out this year. It is so exciting. And congratulations on putting another one out and getting out there and doing it and staying a writer. I hope you stay a writer for a very long time. I've thoroughly enjoyed the bit of your book that I've read, and I can't wait to finish it. So thank you so much for joining me, Julie. Waiting for the Night Song. I'm sure everybody's going to go out and read it. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. This has been such a pleasure talking with you. I always love talking with other writers, so I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, no, it's always good to talk to other writers. It's always good to talk to other writers who have, like, this extraordinary passion that drives them toward it. That's the stuff that I love. So congratulations and good luck, and see everybody else next time. Bye-bye.
Stephanie, story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Story.